A white billionaire sees a homeless little black girl teaching his daughter. What he did next changed his life forever. Get your dirty hands off my daughter right now. The voice cut through the morning air like a knife. Richard Blackstone stood 10 meters away, his $3,000 suit contrasting sharply with the scene before him, a scene his eyes struggled to process. His daughter Sophie, heir to a real estate empire valued at $200 million, was sitting on the ground next to a barefoot black girl. Both were bent over books scattered across the grass. The unknown girl, around 12 years old, whispered mathematical explanations while Sophie frantically scribbled notes. For the first time in months, Sophie was really paying attention to her studies. Kiara Johnson slowly lifted her eyes. No fear, no surprise. As if she had already known this moment would come. She calmly closed the book in her hands and stood, brushing the grass from her palms with a dignity that made Richard hesitate for a split second. "Dad, she's helping me with algebra," Sophie protested, her voice trembling. "I finally understand the equations." "Sophie, get away from her immediately," Richard ordered, his eyes locked on the strange girl who dared to touch his property. "How did you get in here? Where? Are the security guards?" Kiara remained silent, but there was something in her gaze, an old calmness that didn't belong to a child. It unsettled Richard in a way he couldn't explain. His security guards appeared, running and panting, confusion on their faces. "Sir, we don't know how she got in. We checked all the cameras." For 2 months, Kiara had studied the Blackstone mansion. She noted every shift change, every blind spot, every distraction in the security routine. Not out of malice, but out of desperation. She needed a safe place to study, away from the streets, away from her mother who wandered in psychotic episodes, screaming at invisible demons. The mansion had a library with windows overlooking the garden. From there, Kiara often watched Sophie struggle alone with homework that cost more than some people earned in a year. She would whisper the correct answers to herself, until one day Sophie noticed her. "Do you know algebra?" Sophie had asked, approaching the fence where Kiara was hiding. "I know everything," Kiara replied simply. "But I don't go to school." Richard snapped his fingers at the guards. "Call the police. Trespassing." "No!" Sophie shouted, placing herself between Kiara and the men. "She hasn't done anything wrong." "Sophie, don't argue with me," Richard said, his voice dropping into that dangerous tone he used to close million-dollar deals. "This girl should not be here." Kiara finally spoke, her voice steady and clear. "You're right. I shouldn't be here. But your daughter was failing 5 subjects before I arrived." The silence was deafening. Richard blinked, confused. "What did you just say?" "Sophie has undiagnosed dyslexia," Kiara continued calmly. "That's why she reverses numbers and letters. It's not stupidity. Her brain just works differently. Something any teacher should have noticed, if they had actually looked at her instead of just collecting tuition." Sophie's eyes widened. No one had ever explained her difficulties without making her feel stupid. Richard felt something shift in his chest. "How do you know that?" "Because I pay attention," Kiara replied. "Something money can't buy." The guards waited for orders. Richard looked from his daughter to the barefoot girl, who had just diagnosed in 2 minutes what highly paid professionals had failed to recognize in 2 years. None of it made sense. How could a street child see what his experts could not? "Sophie," Richard whispered. "That's her name, isn't it?" "Kiara?" The girl nodded. "Kiara Johnson, daughter of no one who matters." Richard studied her face. There was something in her eyes that disturbed him. It wasn't submission. It wasn't fear. It was patience. As if she were waiting for something only she knew would come. "Where did you learn so much about education?" he asked, his tone softening. Kiara smiled faintly for the first time, a smile filled with secrets. When you live on the streets, Mr. Blackstone, you learn to observe people very well. And what I've observed about your daughter in the past 2 months is more than her private tutors have in years. A chill ran down Richard's spine. How did she know his name? How did she know about the private tutors? And most importantly, what else did she know? If you're enjoying this story of how a homeless girl completely changed the life of a millionaire family, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. What happened next, when Richard discovered the full extent of Kiara's knowledge, was something neither he, nor his fortune, nor all his powerful connections could have predicted. Richard crossed his arms, analyzing the girl as if she were just another business problem to solve. Listen carefully, little girl. I don't know what game you're playing, but it won't work with me. My daughter doesn't need charity disguised as friendship. It's not charity, Kiara replied calmly. Sophie really does have dyslexia. Your private tutors charge $500 an hour and never noticed, because they don't care enough to observe. Richard's face hardened. How dare you question qualified professionals? You don't even go to school. Maybe that's exactly why I see what they can't, Kiara murmured, finally lowering her eyes. Richard felt irritation rising. This girl's arrogance was unthinkable. Johnson, he said sharply. Kiara Johnson. He quickly typed her name into his phone. Within seconds, he had results. Mother, with a history of psychiatric hospitalization, address listed at a homeless shelter, no formal education after age 9. Kiara flinched slightly, but said nothing. Sophie, can't you see this girl is manipulating you? Richard pressed on, his voice taking that condescending edge he used in boardrooms. People like her always have ulterior motives. She's probably after money, or trying to get inside this house to steal something. Dad, stop! Sophie protested, tears welling up in her eyes. She never asked for anything, not even food. Richard ignored his daughter and focused on Kiara. How many other mansions have you tried to infiltrate? How many wealthy families did you study before choosing ours? For the first time, Kiara looked up with a calmness that made Richard hesitate. Do you really want to know why I chose your family? She asked. Enlighten me, he said sarcastically. Because your daughter was the only child I saw crying, alone every afternoon in that garden. While other rich kids played or were picked up by chauffeurs, Sophie hid behind the library, trying to solve math problems and whimpering when she couldn't. Richard's jaw tightened. How did she know? About the exact place where Sophie always took refuge? For 2 months I watched you, Kiara continued, her voice gaining strength. I saw you coming home at 9 every night, too tired to ask about Sophie's school. I saw her lying to you, saying everything was fine because she knew you were stressed. I saw private tutors leaving early because they had nothing left to do with a girl they thought wasn't cut out for studying. Richard felt a twinge in his chest, but his anger grew even stronger. You have no right to watch over our family. I wasn't watching, Kiara replied firmly. I was studying. Your library has large windows and I could see the books on the shelves. During the day when Sophie wasn't there, I memorized everything I could. Impossible, Richard snorted. You live on the streets. You don't have access to proper education. Kiara gave a small smile that didn't reach her eyes. Would you like to test me? She knows calculus, Sophie quickly interrupted. She taught me derivatives in 20 minutes. My private tutors tried for 3 months. Richard looked at his daughter, then at Kiara, his disbelief mixed with something he couldn't name. Prove it. Kiara walked over to Sophie's open laptop on the garden table. She was struggling with chemistry yesterday, balancing chemical equations. She quickly typed in a complex sequence. The rule is simple: conservation of mass. The atoms of each element must be equal on both sides of the equation. In 3 minutes, she had solved 5 problems marked impossible in Sophie's notebook. Richard blinked, stunned. Where did you learn that? Public library when it's open. free internet at cafes, books abandoned in dumpsters. Kiara calmly closed the laptop. Knowledge is priceless, Mr. Blackstone. It's the only thing no one can take away from me. A reluctant part of Richard was impressed, but most of him was furious. How dare a homeless little girl be more competent than the professionals he paid fortunes to? No matter how smart you are, he said coldly, you don't belong here. Sophie needs friends from her own social class. Friends like Bradley Hoffman? Kiara asked softly. Richard's blood ran cold. How do you know that name? Your business partner's son, the 15-year-old boy Sophie considers a friend but who called her mentally deficient in the school WhatsApp group. Kiara tilted her head. Or would you prefer friends like Vanessa White, who pretended to be Sophie's friend for 2 years just to borrow money from you? Sophie's eyes widened. How do you know that? Because I listen, Sophie, really listen. When you cry, I want to understand why. When you laugh, I want to know what made you happy. Kiara turned to Richard. Do you think social class teaches empathy? Her rich friends treat her like trash, and her father is too busy building empires to see that she is drowning right under his nose. The silence that followed was cutting. Richard's hands trembled with anger, but also with something he refused to acknowledge. Shame. You're out of line, he said quietly, dangerously. I know, Kiara nodded. I've always been out of line, but at least I'm present. Richard picked up his cell phone and dialed. Security, come to the garden. Now. He hung up and looked at Kiara coldly. You have 5 minutes to get off my property. If I see you here again, I'll call the police. Kiara nodded calmly and began gathering her few belongings, some crumpled papers and a broken pencil. Sophie ran to her, hugging her desperately. It won't work, Kiara whispered in Sophie's ear. But thank you for seeing me as a person. I'll find a way, Sophie cried. I won't let him do this. Richard watched the scene, fighting against a wave of discomfort. Why did he feel like the villain of the story? As Kiara headed for the exit, escorted by security guards, she turned one last time. Mr. Blackstone, you have everything money can buy, but your daughter still cries alone every afternoon. Maybe you should ask yourself why. And then she disappeared through the gates, leaving Richard alone with a question he didn't want to face. Why had the words of a 12-year-old homeless girl struck him deeper than any financial analyst's report? That night, as Sophie ate her dinner in silence, refusing to speak to him, Richard tried to justify his actions. He had protected his family. He had kept dangerous strangers off his property. He had acted as any responsible father would. So why did he feel like he had made the biggest mistake of his life? What Richard couldn't have imagined was that Kiara Johnson wasn't just a smart girl looking for opportunities. She was a survivor, and survivors never give up after the first no. 3 weeks after the expulsion, Richard thought the problem had been resolved once and for all. The street girl had learned her place. Sophie had stopped mentioning her name, and life had returned to normal. Or at least, that's what he thought. What Richard didn't know was that Kiara Johnson wasn't just brilliant. She had spent years on the streets learning to read people, to identify weaknesses, to survive using only her mind. And during those 2 months observing the Blackstone family, she had discovered much more than Sophie's learning problems. Secrets. That would make a powerful man completely rethink underestimating a child who had nothing to lose, but everything to prove. While Richard boasted in his corporate meetings about how he had handled a delicate situation, Kiara spent her afternoons at the public library, using the free computers in a very specific way. She wasn't just studying advanced mathematics or reading about dyslexia. She was researching the Blackstone Corporation. And what she found made her smile in a way that would have given Richard goosebumps. For years, his company had made millions from government contracts to build public housing. The problem? The buildings were made with low-quality materials on contaminated land and were intended primarily for Black and Hispanic families who didn't have the power to complain. 23 children had developed serious respiratory problems in a housing complex built by Blackstone in 2022. The parents filed a lawsuit, but Richard's lawyers had managed to cover it up by buying silence and threatening deportation. Kiara printed everything: contracts, leaked internal emails, medical reports, testimonials from affected families. Within 2 weeks, she had a folder thicker than the files of Richard's own lawyers. "Can I help you?" asked a voice behind her in the library. Kiara turned and found a woman in her 50s, gray hair, reading glasses hanging around her neck. Her ID card read, "Professor Janet Williams, Social Advocacy." "I'm just studying," Kiara replied cautiously. Janet looked at the computer screen, where the Blackstone Corporation logo glowed. "That company has hurt a lot of people I know. Do you have any connection with them?" Kiara hesitated. "Let's just say I have a personal interest." "What kind of interest?" "The kind that ends with justice being served." Janet sat down next to her, intrigued. "I'm a law professor at the local university. I coordinate a legal aid project for underprivileged communities. If you have information about Blackstone's wrongdoing, we should talk." Kiara studied the woman's face. "What do you know about educational discrimination?" "Everything," Janet replied. "It's been my specialty for 20 years. And about billionaires who think they can decide who deserves access to knowledge based on the color of their skin." Janet leaned forward. "Tell me your story." For 2 hours, Kiara told her everything: her friendship with Sophie, the discovery of her dyslexia, the humiliating expulsion, and especially Richard's exact words. "People like her always have ulterior motives. We have a case," Janet said when Kiara finished. "Racial discrimination, denial of educational access, and if what you've gathered about the housing contracts is correct, corporate fraud. But I'm just a little girl without a home. Who's going to believe me over Richard Blackstone?" Janet smiled. "Honey, you don't understand. We don't need them to believe you. We just need Richard to believe he can easily destroy you. Arrogant people always make the same mistake. They underestimate the ones they shouldn't." While they were planning, Richard was in his office receiving a report from his private investigator. "The little girl continues to frequent the public library, sir. She appears to be studying. Nothing suspicious." "Keep watching her," Richard ordered. "Desperate people do desperate things. I don't want any surprises." But Richard made a crucial mistake. In his arrogance, he ordered Sophie to be transferred to a boarding school in Boston, far from inappropriate influences. Sophie protested, cried, begged. Richard was adamant. "It's for your own good. You need to learn how to relate to people of your own social class." What Richard didn't realize was that Sophie, in her desperation, had saved the cell phone number Kiara had secretly given her weeks earlier. At the first opportunity, she called. "Kiara, it's Sophie. My father is sending me away," he says. "It's your fault." "I know," Kiara replied calmly. "He thinks separating me from you will solve his problem." "What are we going to do?" "We're not going to do anything, Sophie. You're going to Boston. You're going to be happy. You're going to study, make new friends, and prove to your father that you've always been smart." "What about you?" Kiara looked at the folder of documents on Professor Janet's desk. "I'm going to teach a lesson to people who think they can throw children away just because they were born in the wrong place." "Kiara." "Sophie, your father thinks he knows power. He believes money can buy everything: silence, obedience, justice. It's time someone showed him that there are things in this world even 200 million can't control." When she hung up, Kiara opened the first volume of case law Janet had lent her. She had a lot of work ahead. Richard Blackstone had completely underestimated who he was dealing with. And people who grew up on the streets knew exactly how to use the arrogance of the powerful against them. 3 days later, Richard received a registered letter at his office. No sender, just a law firm address. When he opened it, he found a single typed line: "Some lessons cost $200 million. Get ready for yours." He crumpled the paper and threw it in the trash, laughing. Empty threats from desperate people. But if he could have seen Kiara at that very moment, sitting in the library next to Janet, reviewing government contracts and preparing a dossier that would shake his empire to its foundations, he might not have been laughing. When you underestimate someone who has nothing to lose, you create the very monster that will devour you. And Richard was about to discover that teaching humility to those who think they are untouchable is an art learned only by surviving where he could never last a single day. 6 weeks later, after Richard had dismissed the threatening letter with a laugh, he was in his office signing another $1 million contract when his assistant rushed in, pale as paper. "Mr. Blackstone, there are reporters at the company's door. Lots of them." Richard frowned. "Probably about the new housing complex in Miami. Tell them to wait." "No, sir. They're asking about Riverside Gardens and about the sick children." Richard's blood ran cold. Riverside Gardens was the 2022 housing project Richard had buried years ago with the help of expensive lawyers and strategic bribes. How the hell had someone dug that up? He turned on the television and nearly fell out of his chair. On CNN, a reporter was standing in front of a pediatric hospital, holding a thick dossier. "Exclusive documents obtained by our station reveal that Blackstone Corporation knew about the contamination risks on the land where it built public housing intended primarily for low-income families. 23 children developed serious respiratory problems, and their parents were silenced through threats and intimidation." The screen showed photos of contracts signed by Richard, internal emails discussing acceptable public health costs, and even more devastating, recordings of meetings where he himself had said, "If they can't afford better lawyers, it's not my problem." Richard's stomach dropped. "How did they get this?" he muttered, his voice shaking with panic. The answer came in the form of a call to his private cell phone. Unknown number. "Hello, Mr. Blackstone. This is Kiara Johnson. Remember me? The street girl you kicked off your property." Richard gripped the phone so tightly his knuckles turned white. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I got your company's contracts, the recordings of your executive meetings, and the emails you thought you deleted forever." Kiara's voice was calm, almost gentle. "When you live on the streets, Mr. Blackstone, you learn that information is the only currency that really matters. You're just a child." "How?" "I'm a child who spent 2 months watching your family, sir. Enough time to install a small program on the laptop Sophie used in the garden. A program that gave me access to the entire Blackstone family home network." Kiara paused. "Including your home office, where you held video conferences with your lawyers about how to silence the families of Riverside Gardens." Richard felt the world spinning around him. "That's illegal, an invasion of privacy. Do you know what else is illegal, Mr. Blackstone?" Kiara's voice grew colder. "Building public housing on contaminated land, bribing health inspectors, threatening immigrant families with deportation so they won't sue your company. But apparently, legality only matters when poor people break the rules." On television, the reporter continued. "Most shocking of all, documents show that CEO Richard Blackstone himself referred to the victims as an acceptable statistical problem during a meeting recorded in September 2022. Richard's phone began to ring incessantly. Other channels, newspapers, magazines. Within 20 minutes, the story was all over social media. Blackstone corruption was trending worldwide. "What do you want?" Richard asked, his arrogance now turned to desperation. "Justice," Kiara replied simply. "Something you thought you could buy, sell, or hide. But you know what I discovered during those weeks studying law with Professor Janet Williams? Justice is not a commodity. It's priceless, and it cannot be negotiated. Listen, we can work this out. How much do you want? $1 million? $2 million? Kiara laughed. A genuine child's laugh that contrasted sharply with the sophistication of her plan. "Mr. Blackstone, you really don't understand, do you? I don't want your dirty money. I want you to pay for the 23 children who got sick. I want the families to receive fair compensation, and I want you to learn that black girls from the streets can be much more dangerous than arrogant white billionaires. Richard looked out the window and saw black vans parked in front of the building. Federal agents were climbing the stairs, carrying boxes and equipment. How? He whispered into the phone. Professor Janet Williams knows a lot of interesting people at the Department of Justice, Kiara explained calmly. People who have been waiting for years for solid evidence against Blackstone Corporation. I just gave them the gift they wanted for Christmas. Richard dropped the phone. On television, the reporter announced, Blackstone Corporation stock has plummeted 80% in less than 2 hours. Sources close to the investigation suggest this may be just the tip of the iceberg. As agents searched his office, Richard thought of the barefoot girl he had kicked off his property 6 weeks ago. The girl he had called an intruder, a manipulator. People like her. The girl who was now systematically destroying everything he had built in 20 years. His phone rang again. Mr. Blackstone, are you still there? Kiara asked. What do you want from me? He said, defeated. I want you to remember this call. Every time you see a poor child on the street, I want you to remember that underestimating people is not only cruel, it's stupid. Her voice softened. And most of all, I want Sophie to grow up in a world where girls like me don't have to hide to study. Sophie, Richard murmured, remembering his daughter for the first time in weeks. She called me yesterday from Boston, Kiara continued. She said she finally understood that she's not stupid, just different. She also said she's proud to have had a friend like me, even if it was only for a short time. Richard couldn't respond. Do you know what the saddest part of our conversation was, Mr. Blackstone? He stayed silent. She said she hopes that one day her father can be proud of her the way I always was. A billionaire's daughter, dreaming of the love that a homeless girl gave freely. Kiara sighed. You had an incredible daughter and you almost lost her by protecting prejudices that are worthless. The call ended. Richard sat silently watching his life crumble on television as federal agents carried away boxes of evidence. A case built more competently by a 12-year-old girl than by his own internal auditors. Outside the building, Johnson sat on the steps of the public library, watching the news on the cell phone Janet had lent her. Sophie had sent her a message. I saw it on TV. My dad deserved it. You're amazing. Kiara smiled and typed back. Justice isn't revenge. It's education. Maybe now he'll learn. She put her phone away, picked up her borrowed law books, and went into the library. She had a lot more studying to do. The world was full of Richard Blackstones who needed to learn that underestimating the right people could cost much more than $200 million. It could cost everything. 6 months later, Richard Blackstone was sitting in a modest apartment in the suburbs, far from the mansion he had lost to pay damages. Blackstone Corporation had gone bankrupt. His former billionaire friends no longer answered his calls. But for the first time in years, he was actually talking to Sophie. Dad, did you see? Kiara won a full scholarship to Harvard, Sophie said, showing him the news on her tablet. Law. She's going to specialize in social justice. Richard looked at the photo of the girl who had destroyed his empire, and strangely, he smiled. She deserves it. Sophie blinked, surprised. Aren't you angry? I'm ashamed, Richard admitted. She taught me that social class does not define character. I defined mine when I chose to humiliate her instead of listening. That same week, Kiara received an unexpected letter. It was handwritten by Richard. Thank you for showing me who I really was. My daughter is proud to have been your friend. I should have been too. May you change the world, as you changed ours. Kiara kept the letter carefully. She understood now that justice wasn't about destroying people. It was about teaching the world that everyone, regardless of where they were born, deserves respect and opportunity. 2 years later, the first law Kiara helped draft as an intern at a civil rights office was passed. Free access to educational resources for street children. The bill was called the Sophie Blackstone Act, a tribute to the friend who saw her as a person when the world had seen only an intruder. Richard, now working humbly as a consultant for affordable housing NGOs, watched the signing ceremony on television. His daughter stood next to Kiara, both of them smiling. He had lost an empire, but he had gained something money could never buy. Her genuine admiration and the lesson that underestimating people is not only cruel, it's stupid. Kiara's true. Revenge was not to destroy Richard Blackstone. It was to become exactly what he said she could never be. A woman who would change laws, protect vulnerable children, and prove that intelligence and dignity have no fixed address. Never judge a child by circumstances they did not choose. Human potential knows no zip code, no skin color, no bank account. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the very people society teaches us to ignore. If this story inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories that prove true greatness always finds its way, no matter how many obstacles try to stop it.